first of all, thank you to all who have joined us now and potentially who join us with either the recording or a little while later down the way. Thrilled to have you. And I will tell you that I put together a brand new sort of PowerPoint for this talk because I was sort of so inspired by thinking back to Babe Ruth and to that time in baseball. And so what I'm going to do is try to both connect my life a little bit with Babe Ruth's, which is a little impossible, but I kind of found some fun ways I think we can all think about that together. So let me begin, and thank you to the Babe Ruth Museum for bringing me on tonight. And in honor of Women's History Month, I very much appreciate that and welcome this opportunity. So let me share my screen and we will begin. I guess, Katie, if people have questions, they'll put them in the chat.
Yep.
And we'll catch up.
Yeah, we'll do a Q&A at the end. If you want to ask your question, you can. If you have other questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat.
Fabulous. So here we go. And let me share and we'll see what happens here. Okay. Let me play from the start. So I'm going to start with this whole notion that seems to really feel, and certainly in the 1970s, it felt very much sort of embedded into baseball. This notion of this game that over generations had been passed down. And the way that it was typically thought of being passed down was fathers to sons, grandfathers to sons. As Donald Hall says in his essay in 1984, which you may note is 6 years after my lawsuit was in fact, kind of, we challenged baseball with the equal access issues in 1978. In 1984, he's still writing about baseball being fathers and sons playing catch. You know, the diamond circles what we are, joining the long generations of all the fathers and all the sons. And so I kept wondering, well, where are the women in this? I had, found my way into baseball, and I'm going to give you a little sense of kind of how I got there. But for me, it was definitely a mother to daughter transition. My father had grown up in Iowa in the Midwest, and he loved football. And so he introduced me to football, but baseball was my mother's introduction. And this shows you a picture of her with me actually in Iowa, because my parents after World War II had gone back to Iowa to get their advanced degrees before my father became a college professor. My mother went on to have 5 children. I was the oldest of the children. And we moved to Massachusetts, though Western Massachusetts. She had grown up near Boston, and you'll hear her story in a minute and how that relates to baseball. I'm going to start here. And this is in 1951. And the date I'm starting with is May 30th. And that is because that's the date that I discovered that my grandfather, Robert S. Edwards, who lived in Milton, Massachusetts, sat down and wrote a letter to my mother, who had just given birth to me 3 days earlier. I discovered this letter. You can see it was mailed with 6 cents worth of postage, which pretty much dates it back to the 50s. But it was mailed 3 days after my birth. And when I found it in my mother's box that she had saved of all the letters and everything surrounding my birth, it sort of helps when you're the first of 5 children because they tend to save everything. So I found this box and I opened various envelopes. And when I discovered the one from my grandfather, everything started to make sense to me. I'm going to leave this up as I begin to read a little from my book to give you a sense, because people often ask me, for a girl growing up in the 50s and 60s, how is it that you ended up with such a passion, for baseball that followed you as you went into your professional life and found a job at Sports Illustrated? So let me just read to you, if I can, a short section. This will be the only time I'll read from my book today. But keep in mind what's on the bottom of this screen as I go ahead here. On May 27th, 1951, as the New York Yankees were on a train going to their three-game series at Fenway Park, my mom checked into University Hospital in Iowa City to have her first child, me. I was breeched with the umbilical cord wrapped around my neck. So to deliver me, the doctors had numbed my mom with spinal anesthesia. Well, then they forgot to warn her against sitting up. So when she did, her incapacitating headache forced us to stay longer in the hospital. While she recuperated, my dad paid $2.65 to telegraph news of my birth to her parents in Milton, Massachusetts. The next day, the Red Sox beat the Yankees 3-2, even though its star player, Ted Williams, went hitless. Well, I was 4 days old by the time my grandfather in Milton rolled a sheet of lightweight paper into his typewriter and began his letter to my mom, my dearest Jean. After declaring me to be a smart girl and misspelling my name, he expressed his excitement at my birth. Quickly, however, he transitioned to the vital news of the day, recalling for my mother how the Red Sox had swept the Yankees. And this section of the letter is something that I have up here that you can take a look at and read as I go on. As a teenager, my mom had been his Fenway Park seatmate, and their baseball bond endured their separation. From afar, he typed his rat-a-tat play-by-play account of the Red Sox doubleheader win that had sent the Yankees on their way to Detroit. When I found his letter in my mom's papers, his words affirmed my visceral connection with baseball. But when I was born, the notion that I or any girl would grow up to cover Major League Baseball for the world's leading sports magazine was so laughably absurd as to be out of the realm of possibility. Of course, my mom's pedigree as a baseball fan gave me a running start, but the odds that my life would turn out as they did were slim to none that day when her Fenway Park seatmate welcomed me into the family. 7 years later, my mom took me to my first baseball major league game at Fenway Park. As we fell in with the crowd pressing through the short passageway taking us into the ballpark, my mom squeezed my hand tightly. And when we emerged into that ballpark, I tugged her hand to telling my mom to stop. I turned my head slowly to take in the full measure of this compact ballpark until my eyes settled on its pristinely mowed grass, shimmering in the afternoon's bright sun. When we walked to our grandstand seats near third base, the park's towering left field wall with its embedded scoreboard seemed enormous. I mean, I'd seen this green monster on TV, but being this close, it was magical. Soon after my mom and I reached our seats that day, I went as close to the field as I could get, and I leaned over the low wall as far as I could to try to touch the field. Well, I couldn't, but I wanted to try. And years later, with Sports Illustrated, whenever I was at Fenway Park, I reached down to touch the grass, rekindling those joyful memories of my first game. Baseball hooked me that first day, and it never let go. So when I became a baseball reporter with Sports Illustrated, one of the incredible gifts that my mother gave me at that time that really continued to seal the bond that we had through baseball were 3 packets of these pictures of the starting lineups of the players that came north from spring training each season. And during the 40s, this was 1941, the packet that she gave me where she'd written the starting lineups. She gave me each of these pictures, and on them, the most amazing thing was to see this little pinprick of a hole at the top of each one. What that told me, and what I can still see in them to this day, is that she put up around her room all of these pictures around the cornice of her wall. And while she listened to the games on the radio when the team was away, she kept score of every game. And then she would clip the stories from the 5 newspapers in Boston then that covered the team. And she gave all of this to me when I became a baseball reporter at Sports Illustrated. With her passing, certainly, this is the gift that she gave me that I treasure the most. So now we're going to move to Babe Ruth. And we're going to recall the 1918 World Series. And perhaps you now can understand, as I've read to you about my affection for the Red Sox that I learned through my mother, as well as Fenway Park, that I would naturally start with Babe Ruth as a Red Sox player. So let's just recap for a moment the 1918 World Series, in which the Red Sox defeated the Chicago Cubs in 6 games. In that series, Babe Ruth was the pitcher, and he threw a complete game shutout, which was a 1-0 victory over the Chicago Cubs in game 1. And by game 4, he went 8 innings, not 9, but he earned the win. And he hit a 2 RBI triple despite injuring his left hand in a fight before the game. And I particularly like this Cracker Jacks ball players card that I found of him from 1915. Whoops, there we go. And of course, by the next year, by December of 1919, Babe Ruth was no longer with the Red Sox. He had been sold, as anyone knows, who's on this webinar tonight, for $25,000. So setting up the curse of the Bambino, and for my mother in particular, who was born in 1924, it took her 80 years. She had to live 80 years to see the Red Sox come back and win another World Series. What I wanted to touch on briefly before we get to my lawsuit is the connection that baseball had during the era of Babe Ruth, those early years, with women's suffrage and their advocacy for women's suffrage. Because the women's suffragettes, particularly from the years 1915 to 1917, found their way into many baseball parks, really culminating in the July 7th game. Well, there was a July 7th game in Philadelphia, but then soon after that, or early before that, I'm sorry, on May 18th, there had been a game between the Chicago Cubs and the New York Giants at the Polo Grounds. And during that game, they sold tickets. They put all sorts of yellow banners up. They really understood that they wanted to go where the men were, and they convinced a number of the players to wear sashes that said women's vote, women's suffrage. So it was interesting to me to discover this kind of history that engaged such a powerful advocacy movement for women's rights back at the turn of the century. And here is a suffragette from New York that is going to play a pretty extraordinary role in the history of baseball, one that continues every time any fan goes to the ball game. We hear the music for Take Me Out to the Ball Game. And in that, we all stand, at least we do in Fenway Park, and we sing Take Me Out to the Ball Game, but we only sing the choruses. So this is a picture of Trixie Fraganza. Trixie Fraganza was an incredible suffragette. She was also the mistress of Jack Norworth, who wrote Take Me Out to the Ball Game. And according to his accounting, he wasn't a baseball fan, but he happened to be on a subway where he saw a sign that talked about the game being played at the Polo Grounds that day. And he wrote the song while he was evidently on the subway. And later it became, as the first music cover to it says, the sensational baseball song, Take Me Out to the Ball Game. And the woman who is on the cover of the music, is in fact Trixie Fraganza. So we again have this mixture of baseball and the suffragettes. So I'm going to just play you a little of the first stanza that we never hear, just so we can get a sense of the fact that this was a song written about a girl who loved baseball, which I never knew until I was researching my book. In this case, this is sung by Carly Simon. So we'll listen to just the first part of it.
Lady Casey was baseball man. She had the fever and she had it bad. Just to root for the hometown crew. Every cent that Katie spent. On one Saturday, her young beau called to see if she'd like to go to see a show. But Miss Kate said no. I'll tell you what you can do. Take me out to the ball game. Take me out with the crowd. Buy some peanuts and Cracker Jacks. If I ever get back, 'cause it's root for the home team. If they don't win, it's a shame. 'Cause it's 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out at the old ball game.
So, when I think back to the time in the 70s when I was around a lot of ballparks, I sang that song, I can't tell you, hundreds and hundreds of times. I never realized that it was written about a girl who loved baseball so much that she turned down the possibility of going to see a Broadway show because she'd rather have her boyfriend take her to a ball game. Let's skip ahead very quickly. The men go to war and the women come on the baseball field, as we all know, in the All-American Women's Professional Baseball League. By the time I was 3 years old, that league was gone. One of the two things that stand out to me in these pictures is the fact that I don't think you would have ever gotten any man baseball player who would have agreed to slide into bases in shorts. The women had no choice in the matter. They were given their uniforms by the men who paid them, and they were also given the etiquette and makeup lessons that were mandatory for them to go. So while they played baseball and they played it well, they also played it certainly with a sense that they were women playing a man's game, and it was very important for them to look like women while they played. So let's go over very quickly baseball in the 220s, because what you begin to see, 2020s, you begin to see a really large number of women coming into prominent positions in Major League Baseball, really for the first time in the 21st century. You see the Giants hiring Alyssa Knockin, and she becomes the first female MLB coach ever to be on the field, as she's congratulated there by the opposing player who recognizes this historic moment. You see Kim Ng, who was hired to be the general manager of the Miami Marlins. You see Rachel Balkovec, who just shattered one of baseball's glass ceilings when she was hired to manage a New York Yankees minor league team. You see these two women here in Boston who were both hired to coach in professional baseball. One of them being the first Black woman ever to coach in professional baseball. What I want to point out with this headline here, it didn't just happen with these Red Sox, it's happened with all of the women I just showed you. None of them are in the same position now that they were even 5 years ago. So many of them have left without saying why, as though they do not want to burn bridges on their way out. Kim Ng was fairly public that her position that she held in the Marlins, she was put under the direction of a man who was brought in over her. She had just succeeded in taking the Marlins to the playoffs. She didn't feel she wanted to stay under that situation, and so she didn't. Let's just look at a few other things. Jen Powell is expected After spring training, expected to soon become the first woman umpire in Major League Baseball. We have women's scoring games now, and that's just started to happen in the 2020s. We have broadcasters. Certainly, you all know Melanie Newman in New York, in Baltimore. And last year, after seeing a sign held up by Ellie Dowdy, she invited Ellie, a 10-year-old girl, to join her in the broadcast booth. And the notion is that this is, again, the generational passage. Women to girls, women to girls. You see here Jenny Kavner, who's the first woman with the job of a primary play-by-play broadcaster. She took the job out in Oakland, and Jenny just did a book event with me out in Denver. So these are women who are starting to blaze trails in the 2020s through baseball. Let's go back now, and I'm going to try to acquaint you a little bit with my story and then leave time for questions. My story is about baseball in 1978, and the cartoonists give you a pretty good idea. What I was fighting with was not to be locker room equals with the players inside there, although many people confused that and suggested that I be handed some underwear to put on so I could join the men who were presumably going to be naked. But what my lawsuit was about was equal access. It was having the same access to my sources for my stories that the men had to theirs. And that meant being in the same place at the same time that the men were to interview the athletes. And because of baseball's decision, those interviews happened in the clubhouses. Let's see, where are we? Why is this not going? Okay, there it is. Okay, so these are some other cartoons from it. Locker room, no place for women. Women are court bound to gain locker room entry. It gives you some sense of what was about and shows you a little bit of the locker room as it's imagined in there. Let's see. Going to give you a little flavor of the time. In 1976, I am going to be sent out as a baseball reporter for Sports Illustrated with Roger Kahn, who had written The Boys of Summer, had been assigned by an editor at Sports Illustrated to do a series that was going to look at the old timers of baseball. And so one of the places that we went was Chicago to the White Sox to spend some time with Bill Veeck, who then owned the Chicago White Sox for the second time. So I'm going to start off right in my own offices of Sports Illustrated and show you what Roger Kahn wrote in his book, October Men, which came out in 2004, in which he dedicated a chapter to our trip. And I'm going to read from that. He says, I could not be in the Cincinnati. He's talking about how we would go to Cincinnati afterwards because the Dodgers were going to be there, and he wanted to talk with Walter Alston for this Old Timers series. So noting that he couldn't be in the dugouts at the same time, Cincinnati and Dodgers, that they might need to hire a helper. And so one of Sports Illustrated's male editors suggested that their best staff baseball researcher, Melissa Ludtke, travel with me. Undertaking on-scene baseball reporting was still new for women, not only at Time Inc., but everywhere. So I said thanks, and the editor, trying the sort of humor one seldom hears today, said, "Take her for the whole trip. You can do anything you want with her, just as long as you return her in 2 weeks." And Roger writes, not knowing how to respond, I chose silence. So that's within my own company. That's within my own, kind of line of reporting duty up to the editor on down. Once we got to Kaminsky Park and we got up to the press box, Roger was sitting in the beginning of the front row of the press box with Bill Veeck. I was sitting behind him. I think I was 2 rows behind him. He says second row. And he notes that one writer came up and said intensely into his ear, "Your girlfriend doesn't belong here. You know that. What do you think this is? Ladies' night at the Turkish bath?" So again, it gives you a somewhat of a flavor for how things were back then. After the game, we were supposed to meet in the Bard's room at Kaminsky Park with Bill Veeck. And as soon as I got there with Roger Kahn, Here is how he recalls that scene. He said, a few sports writers glared at Melissa, then at me, though I knew some of them. No one offered even a nod or even a friendly look. It is as though I had brought a harlot into the temple. And after a bit, the bartender motioned me aside and he whispered, Sir, your secretary will have to drink in the hall. I snapped. She's not my secretary. She's a reporter. And if she has to drink in the hall, I will drink there too. And we left. I'm going to talk a little bit about Yankee Stadium because during the 1977 season, which was my second full season on the baseball beat, I spent a lot of time with the Yankees. They were a team that was a soap opera off the field and quite an amazing team to watch on the field. Mickey Morabito was the rookie PR person. He was my same age. And Billy Martin, who was the manager, was a very, very tight with Mickey. And so midway through the season, Mickey came to me after hearing my frustrations about not being able to get to the players because I did not have access to the clubhouse. He came to me with a suggestion, and that was that he go in through the front door of the clubhouse. Note here, I say no reporters are allowed anywhere into the shower or toilet areas. They are separated and walled off. The only place reporters are allowed is in the locker room itself, not this area. Players can choose how to return from showers into the locker room. They can wear a towel, underwear, however they choose. In this case, because he knew I was not going to be allowed into that area, he suggested that he go in the clubhouse, he come around through the passage, meet me at the side door, and bring me into the manager's office. And that's what we did for the rest of that season. At the very end of the season, the last two games, Mickey Morabito gave me a daily clubhouse pass. You can see it up there. This pass is now actually in the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. That's Billy Martin in his office. It gives you a sense of what the clubhouse looked like. And so Mickey gave me that. I went to him and I said, did you really mean to give it to me? He said, absolutely. He said, you have absolutely earned it. I know you'll use it in the, way that will be in accordance with how you've handled yourself the whole time, and it's yours. And so for those two games, I used that pass to go into the locker room before the game, between batting practice and the game. What I want to point out to any of you who have not reported on baseball is that it is in that period, that 50 minutes before the game, when most reporters do most of their work. It is not after the game. After the game is very chaotic. It is when daily reporters need a quote or two to go into their paper. That's the usefulness of that time. Those 50 minutes are invaluable for a magazine reporter like myself. And all the players remain dressed in their uniforms. So this is the juncture where we have to conclude, unlike the sports writers in the 1970s concluded, we have to conclude that nudity was never the issue. If nudity was the issue in this case, if their fear of me seeing men undressed was the issue, then why wouldn't I have been allowed into the locker room in those 50 minutes? It was really about excluding women and trying to get us to go away. I didn't go away, and by the 1977 World Series, I was actually officially assigned by Sports Illustrated to be on their coverage team for the World Series. This was at that point, back then, probably the biggest assignment of the year for a sports reporter. And I was so thrilled that I'd spent these 2 years. I really felt very confident. I went up there. I had a clubhouse a pass that said I had access to the clubhouse, but I realized that the Dodgers did not have any women covering them. So as a courtesy call, I went to talk with Tommy John, who was the player rep for the Dodgers, also one of their starting pitchers. And Tommy John listened very carefully to what had happened with the Yankees. And then he said to me one of the most honest statements I think I heard anyone say during this entire ordeal. He said, personally, I'd be very, very uncomfortable with you in the locker room. He said, but I believe that you have a right to be there. And I just thought, wow, I mean, that's an incredible statement. He said he would hold a team meeting. They would have take a vote as to how the players felt about it, and he would let me know before the first game. He did let me know. It was not unanimous, but a majority of the players voted that they felt as he did. It wasn't something they necessarily wanted to have happen, but they believed I had the right to do it. The reason I have what I have at the bottom of this screen, permission was never granted, with a picture of Bowie Kuhn, is that when Bowie Kuhn learned of my visit with the Dodgers, of the vote taken, and the fact that the players had said it was okay with them if I came in, I had the right to be there. They understood it. The commissioner called me up in the middle of the first game and he said it didn't matter that the Yankees had given me permission. It didn't matter that the Dodgers had given me permission. It didn't matter that the baseball writers had given me a clubhouse pass and given me thus their permission. None of that mattered. He was the only human being on earth who could grant me that permission. And he said that permission was never granted. And then he had added to that it never would be. During Game 6 of the 1977 World Series, comes back to New York, Reggie Jackson hits 3 home runs, and the Yankees win the World Series, bringing the World Championship back to New York for the first time in 14 seasons. It is a time of delirium. The fans that were on the field had found their way through the tunnel and filled these concrete corridor outside of the Yankees locker room. And that's where I had been told by baseball, because they still weren't allowing me in the clubhouse, that I had to stand and wait for this man who was up there in the right-hand corner, Larry Schenk, who was a PR person for the Philadelphia Phillies. He was going to be my male escort. The idea is that I would stand out there and that I would tell him what players he should bring to me that I wanted to speak with. And he would bring them to me and I would conduct my interview and that it would all work fine. In other words, Bowie Kuhn believed ultimately that a separate accommodation for me would be an equal experience, an equal access situation. We believed that separate was not equal. We actually believed in the Supreme Court decision of 1954, unanimous court decision in Brown versus Board of Education, then a fight for racial justice. We believed that it also held for my situation here. Larry Schenk delivered 2 players to me that night, neither of whom had played in the game. I, of course, had asked to speak with Reggie Jackson, who wouldn't, and you can see that he was otherwise occupied inside the clubhouse with his uniform on and with all the men surrounding him, as well as TV cameras on him. I was not allowed to be there. It was a great example of why Bowie Kuhn's notion of providing separate accommodations for women as the solution in this case was not viable. So here comes my judge. After negotiations take place during the fall with baseball, with Bowie Kuhn, that involve my editor as well as the lawyer for Sports Illustrated, it becomes increasingly clear that there is going to be no midway meeting of the minds. As far as Kuhn is concerned, it will always be separate. He will never allow women to be in the clubhouse, and he refuses to have the interviews take place anywhere else but the clubhouse. So we end up filing a case with the Southern District Court of New York in Manhattan, the district court level, and you will see the arrow pointing down. They have this box. They put the names of the available judges in it. There are 27 judges. They put their names in of any who are available. They spin the box. They open it. The clerk pulls out a name, and out of this distinguished court, in which there's only one woman on the court, and she's the only woman who's ever been on the Southern District Court in its 189 years of history. It is, after all, the mother court of our country, founded before the Supreme Court, the only court founded before it. So she is the only woman in the history of this court to be on it. She is also the first Black woman to ever have been made a federal judge in the United States, by Lyndon Johnson in 1966. And she remains, by the time I get there in 1977, still the only woman judge on that court. She is the one who is pulled out after this wheel is spun, and she becomes the judge assigned to my case. What do we know about Constance Baker Motley? Have we heard this name before? We're starting to hear it more. She finally has a forever stamp. Partly because of an observation that Ketanji Brown Jackson made when she became the first Black woman to sit on the Supreme Court. She shared a birthday with Constance Baker Motley, but she observed that if not for the time and circumstance in which Constance Baker Motley was born, raised, and professionally did her legal work, she would have been the first Black woman to sit on the Supreme Court. What had she done? She'd been sent by Thurgood Marshall down to the South to fight the Jim Crow system of racial segregation. She'd represented James Meredith. When James Meredith sent his letter to the NAACP Legal and Education Defense Fund, Thurgood Marshall gave it to Connie and laughed when he gave it to her. He said, "Connie, you take this one. This will never happen. A Black man who thinks he can get into the University of Mississippi?" Well, she made it happen. She took it to the Supreme Court, as she did 9 other cases. She won 9 of them outright, and she won her 10th by the Supreme Court overturning its own decision in her first case. Judge Motley, who understood the 14th Amendment and its power and its precedents, as well as any judge probably in our country and any lawyer had ever understood them in her work with racial discrimination cases, ordered on September 25th, 1978, that women's sports writers should have the equal access to interview players. And if baseball insisted that it happen in the locker rooms, then it would happen in the locker rooms. Essentially, though, she could only rule that whatever policy Major League Baseball set, it had to be equal for men and women. I want to just give you a brief sense of how this became a very much of a cultural issue, not just a sports issue. When Charlie Schultz decides to devote a number of Peanuts scripts to a topic, it reaches audiences that wouldn't have been reached in any other way. In this case, Lucy has decided she doesn't want to be a reporter if she's not allowed, if they don't, they don't have a locker room, so she doesn't want to be a reporter. In the Tonight Show, you will see that Betty White is dressed in her torso is covered by a towel, because in this scenario, she is in fact going into the showers to interview Johnny Carson. And on February of 1978, Saturday Night Live did a skit inside of the locker room on that show. O.J. Simpson was the host for Saturday Night Live, so he became the athlete, and you can see where he's decided to put his towel. These are some of the headlines that you saw at the time, and I want to point in specifically to Patrick Buchanan, who at that point was the leading syndicated conservative columnist in the country. And his column goes all over the country. Different headlines go on it, but essentially this one where it says locker room ruling called ERA preview. What does this tell us? It tells us that Patrick Buchanan essentially said that when Constance Baker Motley made her ruling in my case, opening up clubhouses, locker rooms to women reporters, she had essentially sealed the fate of the ERA amendment, which would go on to lose. It would not be ratified by the 2 more states that needed, or 3 more states, I think it was at the time, that needed ratification. Anyone who was alive at that point remembers that Phyllis Schlafly, the conservative advocate, had used bathrooms as the wedge issue, arguing that if the ERA went through, men and women would have to share bathrooms. So this case had a much broader cultural and societal impact than you would think a case simply about baseball might have. You can again see the headline writers had a great time with this case. Even once, the order comes down, judge goes with the curves, strikes out, yanks again. What's this? Women in the locker room, but not in Playboy? A lot of the coverage about me brought it down to one simple theme. And remember, this was a story written primarily by the men who had the pens and the typewriters and the microphones at that time. And essentially, the storyline went like this. Basically, a horny or sex-deprived young woman is going to court so that she can go into locker rooms to see naked men. That was essentially the essence of what the coverage was. It was rarely about equal rights. It wasn't about equality, etc. But funnily enough, as soon as the case comes down and the judge has ruled in my case, we suddenly see women get rights, equal rights. What the men were so excited about is that they believed that her decision would now enable them to go into the girls' locker rooms. They thought, now we can go see Chrissy Everett undress. That was a central theme of their reporting. Well, here's what they didn't get. My case was not about going into the clubhouse. No federal judge could tell a private organization, baseball or the Yankees, that they had to let me into the clubhouse. When we won the case based on the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause, the only thing the judge could order is whatever policy you set up for the media to intersect with the players, with the athletes, that policy has to be equal for men and for women. So in tennis, where they longed to say that they wanted now they could finally go see Chrissy Everett undress, they already had equal access. Because in tennis, the two players or the four players who had played the tennis match came out into a conference room, as they still do, sat behind microphones, and the men and the women were there at the same time. So that became a great disappointment to them when they realized that the case wasn't about the access to the locker room, it was about equal access, and they had it. Let's see, where are we here? Why is this? I don't know where okay. That's it. So I'm going to stop there. That's where I'm stopping. And I thought I'd stop there and see what questions you might have and give us some time to talk in that way. So there we are.
Well, that was great. I learned so many things that I didn't know. The "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" lyrics, that is blowing my mind.
Isn't that
especially.
unbelievable? So I
Really
want to tell you, when I went to Fenway Park last year, I was with a large group of people, and as the song came on and we got up, I turned around to a man who was just a little younger than I was, and I said, "Hey, kind of with my elbow, I said, do you know who that song's written about?" And he said, "No, I have no idea." I said, "It's a woman who wants to go to the ball game. Her boyfriend wanted to take her to a Broadway show, and she said, no, 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 no. Take me to the ball." He was like, "What? What?" Because we never sing those lyrics. So no one knows that song.
Wow.
Yeah. It was one of the great things that I discovered while I was writing my book. One of the great surprises, I should say.
Very cool. All right, so we'll open it up for questions. Bill, did you want to go first?
Yeah, I'd love to. Melissa, I was a couple years behind you as a reporter, then worked for PR in baseball. I, as a reporter, I actually lost a job to a woman, and I was like, all right, at least they're hiring a minority. So I was,
Yeah.
Pissed but not pissed in a sense. One thing that struck me in this, you talked about Tommy John.
Oh, yeah.
I'd never heard that story, and I have been advocating for Tommy John for the Hall of Fame, and that just gives me one more notch
I'd like to think that I'd like to think it would be helpful for him. I really would. And he just, I was actually very surprised. But then in a sense, as I've gotten to know him better through the years, I'm not at all surprised because he's a man of deep faith. He has deep beliefs and deep convictions, and he's a man who lives by them. Now he and I may not agree and don't agree on a lot of things in terms of political. We're probably very, very different on those beliefs. But his willingness, first of all, to listen, to sit in that dugout with me and listen and understand kind of what I'd been through, what the Yankees' solution to it was, the progress that we had made, and then the willingness to say, I'm going to go back to my teammates and we're going to talk, we're going to discuss this, and then come back to me. And, in retrospect, I sometimes wonder, I don't really, because I know what kind of person I was. I understood the importance of gradualism. That's why I only went in and used the press pass that first couple of days before the game. I wanted people to gradually acclimate to me being there. It didn't make up any sense if people were uncomfortable. It didn't make any sense for me to barge into places. And Tommy kind of understood that. And he said to me later, he said, I so appreciated that you actually came to us and you had this conversation rather than simply showing up after the game. Because here they were on a World Series stage. It's a big deal. They don't want to have to deal with another stressor at that point. So I mean, if I can help you in any way to continue making that argument, Bill, know that I'm with you.
No, I appreciate that. I'll yield to someone else. I have another question, but I'll yield to someone else.
Anyone
Steve,
else?
go ahead.
Can I ask a question?
Let me get
Hi.
Sure.
I'm about 20 years younger than you, and I was a huge baseball fan. I was the scorekeeper of my high school team, which certainly doesn't count for very much, but it was kind of a big deal at the time. Um, and when I see those pictures now of like the female broadcasters and stuff, especially the one with the little girl, I think all the time about how it would have been for me as a teenager even to have seen somebody like me. Now, I had no desire to be a reporter. That wasn't I'm not a writer, but there's so many other things that I felt could have been open. And so when I see that now, if people think representation doesn't matter, I only ever saw men in any sort of baseball thing. So I loved seeing this, and I truly can't imagine what it must have been like in the 70s to have to go through what you went through. I did have one question though. When you showed the picture of Reggie Jackson with all the reporters around, I know you pointed out he was in full uniform. Obviously, everyone there was fully clothed. There were cameras and everything. I kind of was wondering. I wonder if there were any even female camera people or photographers there, and
No,
the
there
fact that
were
you had to
none.
stand
No,
outside.
no,
No, I mean,
there were none. But
okay.
but one of the interesting things you bring up, Patricia, with your question, and I write about it at some length in my book because I think it was so um, hurtful to me in so many ways, was an interview that Jane Pauley did with me on the Today Show. And she did it January 3rd. It was 4 days after our lawsuit was filed with the court. And I don't know why, but the people at Time Incorporated and Sports Illustrated didn't think it was necessary to go over any preparation with me. I was 26 years old. I was going to be on live TV for 6 minutes talking about what if I didn't have the ability to see how explosive this issue could be. They did.
Mhm.
I was naive. I thought it was about doing my job. And that's what it was from my perspective. It was the only way I could fully do a job that I absolutely loved and just wanted to perform at my utmost. I wanted the chance, I wanted the opportunity to do it. That's all the lens I saw it through. So I get on to the show with Jane Pauley, and she misinterprets something. She must have heard it wrong or decided that she would turn it around on me, because as we are getting to the end of the interview, there was a big picture of Reggie Jackson up on the wall, and the photographer had been sort of underneath, so his chest is like enormous, and he's just like drinking from a champagne bottle. And it was later on that night. And when I was so nervous going out to do the interview, we were facing each other, and she had her head down in her notes before the interview started. And I was just trying to make chat. And I said, well, is that Reggie? That's Reggie up there. Look at that. I mean, his chest. I was just kind of exclaiming on the photograph. So evidently she took all these notes down. And at the end of the interview, she blindsides me by saying, when you came out here today, you turned to me and said, is that Reggie Jackson's chest? So who are we not to think that you, after all, do want to be in that locker room so that you can leer at the athletes? I was like, first of all, I have been covering this team for 2 years. If I don't know Reggie Jackson, because I couldn't get into the clubhouse, I'd arranged with him to meet him before ball games and drive up to the stadium with him in his Rolls Royce. I knew this man. Okay. So for her to do that, so we get out of that awkward thing, I kind of find my way back to some reasonably sensible answer. And I see Barbara Roche hiding there behind her name. Barbara was my roommate at the time, and thank goodness she'd gone with me that morning because no one else did. And she was a production assistant with ABC Sports. So she had given me some clues about how to do interviews, et cetera, and how to handle myself. And she was there to greet me when I came out. And thank God I could give someone a hug because, Patricia, to your point, Jane Pauley ignores my answer, and she swivels around in her chair and looks into the camera and says, well, we can only imagine what gender that camera is. And I'm Jane Pauley, back to Tom Brokaw. And that was it.
Yeah.
It was the end of the interview. And I'm like, wow. I mean, I learned a very, very valuable lesson in that, very valuable. And that is that I was no longer Melissa Ludtke. I was a media figure that better watch every single word I said because they could be taken and used against me, and they many were, as she had done that day on that interview. So that's a valuable lesson. But I say, thank God Barbara was there at the end because I tell you, I needed just a human touch. I just needed someone to say, the world will keep spinning. You'll be okay. On we go. So, Robert,
thanks for that story.
Thank you. I see your hand up, Robert.
Steve,
thank you, Melissa.
Oops, sorry.
Say, you mentioned Tommy John before, though, but my question has to do with Steve Garvey, though, who was very supportive of Claire Smith during the, I believe it was the World Series with Detroit when he was with the Padres, though. Did you have any interaction with Steve Garvey on this account?
I did on occasion, and I've had more recent occasion to be with him. Claire Smith, I was just with her at a symposium on women in sports media in October, and Steve Garvey, in fact, was there. He and Claire have remained very close since their baseball times. And I have enormous respect for what he did that day. And in fact, it was 1984, and it was the Cubs against the Padres in the National League playoff. And it was in Chicago, and Claire was trying to go into the San Diego Padres locker room. Claire Smith, for anyone who doesn't know, is an African-American woman. At that time, she was covering it, I believe, for the New York Times. She was with the Hartford Courant and then went to the New York Times for many years. And by the way, she's the first and only woman to be inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in the writers' wing. So she has enormous, status in this profession, and well-deserved. But on that particular occasion, she went into the locker room. I should add at this point, because there's a convergence at this point on race and gender, because there are two John Birchers who play on the San Diego Padres at that point. And these issues converged, and two players literally lifted her up under her arms And as they were carrying her out and the door was about to shut, the manager yelled at her, "We don't need you in here," and threw her out in the corridor. Now she's on deadline with her story. She needs to be in there. And at that time, Henry Hecht, who was one of the very few younger reporters covering baseball in the 70s for the New York Post, who was extremely helpful to me, would go into clubhouses and try to get players to come out and talk with me in the dugout. Didn't always succeed, but it wasn't because he didn't ask. Anyway, Henry Hecht is coming around the corner and he sees Claire in the hallway, distraught. And he says, "Claire, what can I do? What can I do? How can I help you?" She says, "Can you go in there in the locker room and ask Steve Garvey to come out?" She knew Steve so well from covering the Dodgers, and they had great respect for each other. Steve came right out, and he said, "Claire, you have to stop crying. I will do anything I can to help you. You tell me who you need. I'll go in, I'll ask the question, I'll bring the player out if he'll come out. You tell me what you need and I will help you." So, Robert, that story stays with me on so many levels because people think in some ways that it was the players who were against this. The players, whenever they had an opportunity to take a vote on this, voted in favor of giving access to all reporters. It was the sports writers. It was the male sports writers. I'm sorry to say this, Bill, but it was the male sports writers who were the toughest. And they were the ones who had the biggest microphones. And they were the ones who really parroted the commissioner on this. They went along with him. For example, the commissioner said to them, bold-faced lie, that he had separate accommodations into which we could go at different ballparks and players would be brought out to us. In 2 years of being on the baseball beat, I never had one PR person come to me when they saw me in a press box or on the field and said, "Would you like us to help you get players afterwards and we can bring them to this separate accommodation the commissioner has set up where you can report?" That didn't exist. It was a complete fabrication. And the sports writers just went along with it. They didn't bother to call me, and they didn't even bother to check with anyone to see that these didn't exist. So it was really, in some ways, rather a shameful sort of parroting that they did. They never did much reporting on it because they knew what they wanted to say, and they knew the storyline that they wanted to convey. And I will point out that not one of these reporters who spilled gallons of ink covering this story in very facetious and mocking ways ever bothered to show up at the court hearing. There was one hearing that lasted 2.5 hours, not too much to ask for a reporter to actually show up in the courtroom to actually hear the arguments in a case that they have been supposedly covering. So when I went to write my book, I'm basically making the argument that I'm reclaiming my story. My story isn't necessarily what the men wrote about it at that time. It's me, not me being a chronicler of how my story was covered by them, but I'm covering the only part of my story that was never covered, and that is the legal case. It was a case about equal rights. It was a case about women's rights, and it's a case that was decided on the 14th Amendment. And that has a history that is incredibly vital for us to understand at this time. And through my judge, I'm able to go back in time, show you how the precedents set in the 14th Amendment struggle for racial justice prior to my case, then accelerated by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who from 1970 to 1976 sets as her mission to go to the Supreme Court, take cases that will get to the Supreme Court to make the argument that gender should be treated like race under the 14th Amendment. That hadn't happened before Ruth Bader Ginsburg did it. The judges laugh at her when she brings in women clients, women plaintiffs, laugh at her. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg starts to bring in male plaintiffs who are given less than because they are a man. Suddenly the judges are paying attention. They are paying rapt attention. And by 1976, in a tiny little case. I mean, you can't even believe this case goes to the Supreme Court. It's an argument about whether the 14th Amendment should be applied in terms of equal protection, because in Oklahoma, women can buy near beer when they're 18 years old, and the men have to wait till they're 21. That was a case called Boren v. something. Anyway, Boren was the president of Oklahoma University. So you end up with a case about the purchase of near beer that actually gets the Supreme Court to raise this in scrutiny, judicial scrutiny of gender in 1976 to intermediate scrutiny. And then my case comes in 77. So this book and my case with the judge I have and the rest begins to tell you about that history of those two incredible social movements in our time that have set the foundation for life today and given us reminders of the fights that we may have ahead for these rights that are being diminished in our time. Okay, I'm off my legal soapbox, but that's what I'm trying to do here with this book, is try to bring it back to what it actually was, which was a legal case about equal rights during the women's movement in the 1970s.
Well, thank you, and thank you especially for clarifying the Claire Smith and the Steve Garvey situation, though, because the backstory is truly remarkable, though.
Yeah, and Steve and Claire are very, very, very close. They're very dear friends. And when I went to her induction ceremony in Cooperstown, Steve Garvey was also there with her for that occasion. As were other players. Don Baylor, very close with Don Baylor. There were a number of players who had such enormous respect for Claire. It was just really incredible to see.
Thank you.
Steve,
Yep.
Did I see your hand going up? Okay.
Yep. So first, I just want to say that was a fabulous presentation. I mean, really, I've seen a lot of these, and that was among the very best, if not the best. That was just tremendous. I'm curious as to what, so many years later now, where we are, what is your sense? How do you feel about, the progress that has been made up to today from where it was? Obviously substantial gains, but just curious as to what your thoughts are on it.
If you'd asked me back in the 70s, again, being young and naive and filled with great hope and, and great expectations, I would have thought things would have happened much faster than they did. I didn't think it would take nearly 50 years for me to be going through some of those slides I did earlier and, really seeing women for the first time ever really coming into the broadcast booths. They'd been in print media for years, but really surfacing off of the sidelines. Now, remember, the sideline reporter came about in the 1970s, primarily following the hiring of Phyllis George by CBS Sports, which set in motion the notion that to be a sports reporter as a woman meant being a beauty queen first. And that was a legacy that continued really up until, only the last maybe 10 dozen years, where you've seen less of an emphasis on the pretty woman on the sidelines. You still see a number of them, and that is a job that if you were to name which gender is going to be most likely to be a sideline reporter in a sports event, it will be a woman. Not to say exclusive, but that's where she is. It's like the nurse and the doctor, used to be. So now what you're seeing is, and I say this as a comparison because you have a number of women. I've just shown you some, Melanie, Jenny, and we cannot possibly forget the most extraordinary story of all, which is Susan Waldman, who is beginning her 21st season as the broadcaster with the Yankees. But before that, she's done 39 years in sports media, with WFAN, Madison Square Garden, et cetera, mainly in the New York area. Incredible, incredible. But along the way, she's gotten death threats. She got death threats to the point where George Steinbrenner took them very seriously. They'd be called in during games, and he would arrange a personal security person to be in a car and follow her all the way home to Westchester to be sure she got home. Death threats for just being a radio broadcaster of a baseball team. I mean, it's insanity. But that's what we're seeing play out on social media. We're seeing the misogyny. Back in my day, we didn't know the word misogyny. It didn't exist for us. We didn't know the word sexual harassment. You know, things happened. We sort of set up red lines that we knew shouldn't be crossed, but we didn't really know where those red lines were. You know, all of this has changed. And along the way, a lot of women who have gone into the business of sports media have paid a fairly heavy personal price, you know, for doing the jobs they have. And the ones who have stayed are the ones who have found a support system, have found mentors often, have somehow had something inside of them that is so persistent, filled with such passion for their job, such dedication, such bullheadedness in some cases. And I'd put Susan Waldman in that category. She has endured a lot to be where she is today. And so, you know, we've seen the underbelly of this. We're starting to see more stories on the underbelly of this. We've seen this reporting on the sexual harassment of women in sports media. The Mets lost two people, I think it was 3 seasons ago now, the manager of the team and a high-ranking executive in their front office, both for sexual harassment of people in sports media. Yet I did a show with Bryant Gumbel on this topic a couple of years ago, and their production people were telling me how many women reporters they went to who had instances of this, of, you know, the dealings with sexual harassment, with misogyny, with over-the-line incidents, but they were scared to go on the show. They were scared to go forward and step forward. And you know what? In many ways, they're right, because we see again and again that when women step forward to say these things and to go public, they become the one who is often blamed for it happening. And they become more harassed, and their lives take a course that they don't want them to take. So the safer way is to just sort of absorb it, deal with the trauma, although the trauma has pushed some women out of the business. I mean, we know that inside of the business, the ones who have left because of this. So I want to paint a picture of progress, but I want to also say with that progress has come challenges and, you know, some of the same things I dealt with. And that shouldn't be happening. But you know what? I've kind of learned through this experience that if you get a great lawyer, and believe me, I had the outside counsel for Time Incorporated. His name was F.A.O. Schwartz Jr. Yes, F.A.O. Schwartz, great-great-grandson of the founder of the toy company. But let me tell you what he was doing before he represented me. He'd taken a 2-year leave from his White Shoe New York law firm. He'd been the youngest chief counsel on a congressional committee, in this case, the Church Committee on privacy and surveillance by our government. Does that sound like a familiar topic? So he had been that counsel. In that time, he had done the investigations that led to the founding of the government's counterpol operations against the women's movement, or, you know, the spying on the Black Panthers. He is the man who found the letter that was written supposedly anonymously, but it was sent by J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI to Martin Luther King Jr., suggesting that he commit suicide before he go over to accept the Nobel Peace Prize. This is a man of enormous integrity, enormous accomplishment, and great brilliance. So I had the best. I had an attorney who understood how to argue this case against a private company and still have a judge rule for us based on the constitutional protections that are usually only given to government entities when they're involved. So this was brilliance, okay? So I had him, and I had a judge who understood the 14th Amendment and understood discrimination to its core. Even so, even with this order, you saw what happened. Robert asked the question about what happened to Claire Smith in 1984. What I came to understand profoundly is that the law can be changed much easier than attitudes will change. Attitudes take longer, they're tougher, and as we are seeing, they can recede, they can pull back from places where they would have offered societal support for things. And suddenly you find that that societal support has been taken away by wedge.
Jay and Eli are inside again.
So,
sorry.
Jay and Eli are in sync.
so anyway, that's just a few observations that your question brings to mind. It's never a simple answer. And I probably went on too long, but it's a complicated, it's complicated.
Thank you. Thanks.
So I guess we've got an order of business is that I've put everyone's. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Katie, I saw a question about how to purchase the book, which I
Yes.
love, of course.
Yes.
But I want to give each of you, my special friends, a special code that will get you a 30% discount on the book, as well as free shipping. And you can avoid Amazon, which is one of my great delights these days. So what you would do is you would go online and go to Rutgers University Press, which is my publisher, Rutgers University Press, put the name of the book in, Locker Room Talk. It should come up on its separate page. And then the code that you should apply. Oh, you went to Rutgers, Patricia. Fabulous. You'll love this. The code you should use, capital letters, R for Rutgers, R USA 30, because 30 is the discount you're going to get, 1/3 off, and then it's going to give you free shipping. So it's a good deal. It's a good deal. And if any of you do that, and then Katie, you can put my email into the chat or whatever. It's a very simple one. It's standard Google, melissa.ludtke@gmail.com. It's standard Gmail. I have wonderful, wonderful book plates. Well, I hope you'll think they're wonderful. And I will use these book plates to send to you if you want. I can be inscribed to anyone you want to inscribe to. I just sent one off to Iowa yesterday. And that way, if you want to give it as a gift to someone and you want me to inscribe it to them, you just let me know and I will do that and send it. I'll send this to you to put in the book, and you can keep the book or send it to someone you want. So that's the best way I know how, if one wants to get the book.
And you will be at the museum on Saturday, May 10th, as part of the Baltimore's Saber series. So if anyone is around on May 10th and they want to come see you at the birthplace, you can also get it signed there. All right. Any other questions?
Just Melissa, thank you very much, as somebody who's been both sides again, and go back to close to your era. One thing I wanted to point out, it was interesting to see the one headline from the court case: Coon loses sex issue.
Indeed, Bill, you're
I
picking
mean,
up on it. Yeah.
What newspaper would deem that? I mean, back then, yes, but I can't imagine a newspaper deeming that unless it was, our current president saying it.
Yeah, I mean, this was the 1970s.
Yes, I mean, I saw that headline and I was like, wow, that's what they took out of that.
Yeah, it is. Well, you would have loved
Wow.
Yeah, you would have loved the headline that I didn't show tonight, which was at the beginning of this, and I believe it was on UPI. I could be wrong. The headline was "Deprived Woman Sues Baseball." And it talked about, me being deprived of,
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
yes. So,
Well,
all gloves.
and
Yeah.
and if I could just say, I mean, as I said, to support Melissa, not that guys were in the locker room looking at guys, but guys were in there to get autographs. There were guys that are there not professionally,
Yes.
and it was a problem to those of us who were doing our job. So having a professional woman in there was not a problem.
Thank you.
I mean, trust me.
Yeah.
I had more. I was in that like early '80s,
Yeah.
mid '80s era, and we had more problems at that time with uh, the freelancers who were coming in to get autographs,
Right.
or the news. I will say, I mean, with some it was the women reporters from news stations or whatever. They didn't know what they were doing in there. It wasn't necessarily that they were looking at things, but just they didn't know the protocol.
Yeah. Well, they were
You
usually
know,
set up by by the producers at
right?
the station because they thought it would be fun or funny. Um,
Exactly.
you
And
know,
they didn't
yeah,
know, but they didn't know the protocol. They didn't know where they were supposed to
exactly.
be, when they could come in, go out, when they had to be out of the clubhouse. That was the biggest problem back then, was you're sending people in just to send women in.
That's right. That's right. And
And
yeah,
then you had people that had no sports media training,
yeah,
you know, and didn't have a clue.
yeah.
And that was the biggest problem back then,
Well,
honestly.
I'll just end quickly, Katie, with just this last story on Bill's point. A lot of people, in fact, one of my fellow sports writers at the time actually wrote a book without actually verifying with me that she played out this scene of me being at Yankee Stadium the night after the judge's order came down at the first game after the order came down, that she had me in the clubhouse and this whole scene. And, after her book came out, it was published. I called her and I said, you know what? I wasn't there that night. She said, oh, no, you were there. You were there. I said, I ought to know whether I was there or not. And I'm telling you, I wasn't there. And you know why? It was purposeful, because that was not my story. That was the game in which every TV network in New York and New Jersey and Connecticut was going to send one woman up there, and they were going to stand in front of the camera and put the microphone in the player's face and say, what do you think about me being here? I didn't want anything to do with that media circus. That was not my story. I was in the clubhouse the 2 days later when Ron Guidry pitched, I think, some incredible record complete game again. He won the Cy Young that year. And the only way you could talk to him was to stand in the clubhouse outside of the trainer's room where he had his arm in ice for 25 minutes.
Right.
He couldn't have come out of that locker room. He had to be in the trainer's room. So I stood with a gaggle of, male reporters. And there was one other woman there, Donna Foote from Newsweek, who actually was assigned to do a story on Ron Guidry because he was walking his way toward the Cy Young. And she and I were there. We had access. It was the only way she could do her story because Ron Guidry was her story. And so, but I wasn't there that first game. To your point, I stayed away. I didn't want to be part of that.
Yeah.
It wasn't me. So anyway, that's that. Yeah. Okay.
And thank you also for pointing out Claire Smith, who
Yeah.
is a gem of a person,
Yep.
and a gem of a writer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. Yep. And now she's got a sports
And-
media center named after her at Temple University, which is just
Yes.
fabulous. So, and she's
Absolutely.
pouring all her
Fabulous.
pouring all of her energy into doing exactly what Melanie Newman is doing and Jenny Kavner is doing, which is to be there mentoring that next generation, being sure that they have really wide and strong shoulders to stand on. And that's all any of us can do. I'm trying to do it with my book, and they're each doing it in other ways, which is all we can do. So thank you all. This has been fabulous. And I hope you take advantage of the 30% discount, free shipping. And if you want my little, book plate, I'm happy to do it.
All
So-
right. Melissa, thank you so much for joining us tonight. That was great. And I think you've inspired all of us to, inspire that next generation, pay it forward. And
Yeah.
really
That's what-
appreciate it. So thank you, everyone.